Good afternoon, everybody.
So good afternoon, everyone.
Hey.
So this is such a treat and a privilege to have Rip with us this afternoon, to provide some really candid insights about the work that Kresge is doing nationally, and also the very important work that Kresge is doing at the local level in Detroit. So hopefully this some of the ideas that you'll hear will resonate with you and cause deeper questions and be inspirational. And thank you, Janet, for making this possible, for including all this. So welcome to Los Angeles.
Thank you. I didn't realize that we would actually have my home chairs delivered to Los Angeles. Never travel without them.
Well, your home chairs. So someone else said these look like thrones.
Yeah.
So you have thrones in your home.
Yeah. I think we won't go there. Yeah.
So, well, after that. So over the years, under your leadership, Rip, Kresge has made some really significant changes, going from an organization that's been focused historically on bricks and mortar to an organization that's been concerned with capitalization, and now to an organization that is very much committed to expanding opportunity for low-income communities in urban places. Tell us a little bit about that trajectory and the decisions on the way.
Hearing Bob's very generous introduction made me realize how indebted I am to the work that McKnight did. And for those of you who have been in this field a long time, Neil Cuthbert at McKnight, I think ran one of the really fine arts and cultural programs any foundation in America ran. And it was very sort of self-contained in the sense of being very clear about what was art and culture, what was not, what was commercial, what was nonprofit, where the sort of the boundaries ended up bleeding into sort of next generation moves. And when I came into Kresge, what I found was a very different kind of system, one that was quite rigid. For many of you may know, for years and years, Kresge did capital challenge grants, which meant we just invested in buildings. And as part of that repertoire, we did a lot of work with arts and cultural facilities. But it was always a little bit of throwback to sort of the McKnight sort of self-contained look at the individual organization as sort of an entity in of itself. And it increasingly became a little bit out of sync with the kind of work that we were trying to do at Kresge, which really focused much more on community building. How do you put in place the basic building blocks of long-term health and vitality in communities like Detroit or others that are struggling to sort of re-energize their communities, trying to re-engage investment in the community. And so what we ended up doing fairly early on was to say, what do we know best? We know capitalization best. And so there was a whole 3 or 4 year period where Alice Carl, who ran our program at that point, developed a capitalization program because it looked a lot like the Capital Challenge Grant program that we knew. Until at one board meeting, one of our trustees raised her hand and said, what is it about the arts program that fits into the rest of the work of the foundation? It seems sort of like a very important, useful sort of body of work, but it sort of sits over to one side, and it doesn't really engage the kind of issues of opportunity and equity and inclusion that the rest of the body of work is trying to reach. And it was an interesting question, so we actually posed it to Alice and to Regina and to other members of the team, and began trying to understand what an arts and cultural program would look like that had as its first principle the idea of trying to engage community residents in the long-term trajectory of their community's revitalization and renewal. And I think Alice and Regina, and now Regina carries this work with Maria, ended up finding a sweet spot that helped us understand that arts and culture, no less than transportation, no less than housing, no less than health, no less than human services, is an essential building block for the long-term health and vitality of communities. And that was important because there was a sort of an inflection point about 2 or 3 years ago when I had a couple of trustees come to me and say, you know, you seem like it's sort of the opposite of the earlier argument, you seem like you're getting spread too thin. You have all of these different programs, you don't have enough capital to dedicate to each one. How, over time, do you rationalize having such a broad base of health and human services and arts and education and the rest? And I sort of played back the argument to them that, in fact, you can't imagine a healthy, vibrant community without the kind of creative impulses that come out of the kind of problem solving, the kind of community engagement, the kind of community identity that arts and cultural activity involves. And so in many ways what has happened is our program over the last year or two, I think, has become much more integrative, much more pivoting one program off of another. So Regina and her team have recently done a whole suite of activities that sort of go and try to figure out with our environment team what a more useful set of grants might make in a land use setting, or they might work with a health practitioner to figure out what community-based care might look like if it was infused with the kind of creativity that artists and cultural workers bring. So a long way of answering the question, I'm sorry for that, but I think increasingly what we're trying to do is to help both our staff, our board, and the communities with which we work understand that these are actually interbraided systems that ultimately have to be sort of pursued simultaneously in order to be effective ultimately.
So I think the field is in a space, and has been for many years, where it feels obligated to talk about the value of the arts, the public value of the arts often. And it is challenged with developing data and research projects that set out to provide evidence of this. And one of the things that I've experienced at Kresge under your leadership is not a sense that isn't important, but I think there is a fundamental belief that arts and culture matter in a very significant way. And I'm wondering, it's gut almost, and I'm wondering where that comes from for you.
I've struggled with the whole quantification of sort of the outcomes of arts and culture. I remember when Alice first developed the portfolio of creative placemaking working with Jamie Bennett and others, and she immediately sort of backloaded a whole set of very objective measurements of how arts and culture would contribute to safety, would contribute to economic development, could contribute to a whole suite of things that could be measured. And I think she found herself in sort of a cul-de-sac. It was so sort of objectified that I think we ended up sort of getting ourselves tied up in knots. And I think actually we make sometimes this too complicated. I think there is a huge role for trying to be much more sophisticated about measuring outcomes in multiple measures, and I think there is some good work that's being done. But I also think at the end of the day, we just have to look around us. I mean, I'll never forget meeting for the first time with Rocco Landesman when he was coming in as the NEA chair, and he wanted to develop this idea of creative placemaking and put together Art Place that ultimately, I think, took off under Jamie's leadership. And I remember Rocco saying, just go into the community with your eyes open. I mean, there are countless examples of how, in multiple dimensions, the arts not only drive individual expression, but obviously drive economic development, drive social cohesion, drive a sense of community identity, begin to sort of bridge in a way that across all sorts of divides in a way that other disciplines can't. And if you really feel at the end of the day, after having visited those communities, that you've got to sort of create some sort of objective measure of outcomes, that's fine. But he said, I would submit to you that the power of the narrative, the power of the qualitative sense of what happens in a community, the power of community knowledge is ultimately sort of its own measure of success. I don't know if that cuts it for some, but I know, talking to Rocco, that when he went up to Capitol Hill and tried to sell the arts and tried to hold the line on budget decreases, those were the kinds of arguments that lawmakers tended to respond to, because they could know that in Schenectady or in Minneapolis or in Tucson, the arts community had actually moved the needle in some important way in terms of community development, community cohesion, community identity, community legacy. I mean, those are the kinds of issues that I think are very, very difficult to sort of put a precise quantitative pin in. So for me, it's just having been in the field for longer than I care to think, and sort of watching the transformative power that this kind of activity can have. And I know that probably won't be adequate over the long term. We'll figure out some way to measure it, but I'll let somebody else figure that out.
So with the creative placemaking work, by necessity, I think there's evidence of a very broad spectrum of organizations that are implicated and sitting from a Kresge perspective under the arts and culture umbrella. And some of them are unlikely suspects and organizations that wouldn't necessarily be put in the same bucket even. Through this work, I think that you're causing folks to test their boundaries and to stretch and to maybe think differently about who they're connected to and how they might work together, or at least synergistically. What's been your experience in advancing a framework that is that broad?
It's an interesting question. I actually think this is one of those times when the practitioners in the field are just way out in front of us, and we're just catching up. As Bob mentioned, I spent a number of years in Minneapolis, and when you look at the extent to which the arts and cultural community in Minneapolis touches the transit community, touches the community development community, touches the economic development community, really all up and down the line and across ways. You realize that this is something that increasingly, I think, community-based practitioners are comfortable with. I think what we found is that sometimes as grant makers, we're not comfortable with it. That this sort of porousness of these systems that ultimately sort of bump into each other and ricochet off one another and mutually inform one another is actually the way most people work. I think there are examples of the institution on the Hill that does its work as it should, probably much the way it has for 100 years. But I think when I think of something like Heart of the Beats Puppet Theater in Minneapolis, that every May Day collects tens of thousands of community residents to do parades and mask making and community activity, I realize that they're way ahead of the Kresge Foundation in terms of thinking about what their role is in engaging community. But having said that, I think foundations sometimes can try to move some of our large intermediating organizations that aren't quite perhaps as adaptable and responsive. We had a major mud wrestling contest with the Local Initiative Supports Corporation, LISC, one of the nation's most respected and largest community development organizations focused largely on housing, to try to figure out what it would look like if you embedded artists in their community development work. And Michael Ribinger, whom I love, their director, said, it's kind of soft. I can't really rationalize that. We'd have to sort of kind of rethink our approach. And I said, yeah, exactly. And and to his enormous credit, he did. And Eric Takashita was on their staff in St. Paul, the perfect guy to sort of rise up and take this work on. And now increasingly LISC, I think, is exploring what that looks like community to community. We've done a similar sort of set of work with community development finance institutions that aren't traditionally thinking about either how to lend into the arts and culture space or to work with partners in the arts and cultural space in a larger project. And the Serdna Foundation and Kresge helped provide some incentives for a suite of community development finance organizations to do a sort of a re-granting program to their local affiliates and begin thinking about how all of this gets integrated. I just think sometimes when you have a sort of a neutral player like a foundation that deals both nationally and locally, you can use your leverage points to try to get some of the folks who aren't naturally going to come to this work into the game. Policy Link is another example. Angela Glover-Blackwell talked to us a while ago and basically said, we've been thinking about incorporating arts and culture work more into our systems. Would you give us some support to try to test the water, see what that looks like? And sure enough, they're going to have their conference in a couple of weeks, and it's just completely arts infused. I mean, they're thinking about it, they're trying to figure out what it means as a practical level. So I think if we kind of keep picking off some of those unusual suspects, I think we'll actually have done maybe a minor service.
So a lot of that is about getting it in the water, right?
Yeah.
And getting it in the water through the right intermediaries. What do you think are the key elements that will allow that to be sustained?
Maybe I could answer that slightly differently. I actually think that folks who are involved in community-based work see the value of this almost immediately. Often they don't have the capital to do it. Often they don't have the bandwidth to do it. But again, because I think the communities themselves are organizing around these sort of connective activities, I think thoughtful major intermediaries kind of come to the work. The place I think we still struggle, and I was fascinated to hear that some 27% of the folks in this room are from local government agencies, is in sort of the local public sector. I know at least in Detroit, this has been an enormously difficult nut to crack. And for those of you in the room who are from local arts commissions or local mayor's offices or county officials, God bless you. I mean, I think it's just terrific that you're willing to sort of move into this space. But a lot of mayors and a lot of municipal elected officials, I think, really struggle with this construct. Not so much that they don't want to do an arts project in conjunction with a new rail line or a new public structure. It's that actually having arts in the mix as problem smashers is a very difficult concept for them. They're used to making these decisions themselves. They're not used to thinking about what it means to sort of infuse the sort of creative energy into the sort of the problem set and the solution set. And I think here the jury is still out. Jamie Bennett has done a really interesting matrix, many of you may have seen, of the different forms of arts and cultural disciplines and the different sort of outlets in the public systems that the arts and cultural community needs to engage with. And it's daunting. I mean, transportation planners do not have arts at the top of their mind when they're doing a new bridge. They should. A community development practitioner trying to stitch together a new mixed income housing project on the riverfront in Detroit doesn't have arts and cultural workers at top of mind when doing her project. She should. And so I think the next generation of work for foundations like ours, and I think for a lot of the folks in this room, is to try to figure out how do we get into some kind of comfort zone that is sustainable for the public sector decision makers. Again, I think the news is good. I think the trajectory is we're getting more and more of examples on the shelf of what that looks like and how it can work. I always think of Springboard for the Arts and their work on the Irrigate project in Minneapolis-St. Paul, where they just became indelibly embedded in the new light rail project between Minneapolis and St. Paul. Transformed the way the project was done, transformed the impact of all of the communities up and down the line, and I think McKnight deserves enormous credit for having taken that on. But I think we've just got to start pushing these models, pushing these examples, and maybe even pushing some funding to our public sector friends to make sure that they can do this on a more sustained basis.
So turning to the work in Detroit, which has been so complicated and complex, and Kresge has played an enormously important leadership role in that work. The decision in the work to both save and bolster the Detroit Institute of Arts has been controversial.
Really?
Yeah. In case you hadn't noticed.
I hadn't.
And I would love to hear you talk about how was it that the grand bargain, as it's been called, how was it that you were able to push that forward and still keep in mind the alignment of the goal of expanding opportunity for low-income communities, when sometimes it was seen as at odds with?
Yep. It's such an interesting question. When, for those of you who don't know, the grand bargain was essentially this pooled fund that was begun by the foundation community. Kresge, Ford, and a number of others put together a fund that served two purposes. It prevented the diminution of the pension payments to pensioners, and it prevented creditors from stripping the assets of the Detroit Institute of Art. It was really tempting to frame that decision as saving the art or saving the pensioners. It was actually neither. It was those two elements of the bankruptcy would have been litigated for the next decade. If the pensioners had had their pensions cut, it would have violated the state constitutional protection of pensions, and they would have been in litigation forever. And if the creditors had begun reaching the Art Institute's assets, there would have been all sorts of complex arguments about public trust and where did the sort of the ultimate responsibility for holding art in public trust lie. It would have, again, been a decade. So the foundations actually invested in the grand bargain to accelerate the resolution of the bankruptcy, period. We wanted to take litigation off the table. In the process, we protected the pensions. In the process, we prevented the art from being stripped. But the real purpose was to permit us to move on to the real business of community building. And there, actually, I think the news in Detroit is extraordinarily interesting and multifaceted. I don't think it is possible to understand the new trajectory of the city of Detroit without understanding the renewed resilience and energy of the arts and cultural community. And it is in traditional forms, to be sure. It is the traditional institutions like the Art Institute, like the opera, like the symphony, and lots of sort of mid-sized organizations. But even more, it is the energy coming out of folks moving into neighborhoods and reclaiming a house for a flower house. I just over the weekend went to, I don't know if any of you saw, any of you see this article about the flower house in Detroit? It's extraordinary. I mean, this is a young couple who basically bought a house for $250 and then wanted to sort of make it a house of flowers before it was demolished because it was in a tough part of town and needed to be demolished. So all of a sudden they had 146 flower artists from all over the world coming and programming into the different pieces of the house. And they, over the weekend, had, I've forgotten how many tens of thousands of visitors into some of the toughest neighborhoods of Detroit. It's just a great shorthand for the extent to which artists are moving into space and sort of solving multiple issues simultaneously. The sort of the renewal of hope, the elimination of blight, the suggestion of a more positive future. And when you multiply that by 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 times, you get, I think, a real feel for what's going on in Detroit. It is truly remarkable. I know it happens in other communities around the country, and it is probably equally extraordinary in most ways. But when you come to Detroit now and you contrast what was going on 5 years ago, 8 years ago, you simply can't sketch that narrative without understanding the transformative role that arts and cultural workers have played in the city. It's really extraordinary.
So I've always thought, at least in the last several years, that we're in a very particular moment where arts and culture has the opportunity to reassert as part of comprehensive strategy. So we're in a moment where there's interest in place, and there is recognition that you can't deal with health without dealing with housing, you can't deal with housing without dealing with employment, you can't deal with employment without dealing with education. And there really is this fertile moment for the arts to reassert. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Good. Good. So my question is, though, are you optimistic that, one, this might be an extended moment, and two, what will it take for the arts to assert and sustain?
That's such a great question. I didn't mean to be flip, but I actually think you touched exactly what is so promising. I think increasingly, arts and cultural work that is strongly place-based has the power to sort of transform place. I think increasingly, its sort of ability to sort of look beyond its walls, whatever walls means in this context, to sort of embrace other systems is really powerful. Its ability to actually touch, engage, and be a part of community voice and community aspiration is extraordinary. And when you put those pieces together, I think you have a recipe for progress that I just have to believe over time will be so self-apparently important and compelling that local decision makers, I think, will have no reason whatsoever not to embrace it. I just came from a big national arts conference, and a lot of the conversation was about how do we change the national arts narrative? How do you sort of reframe the importance of the arts at sort of a meta level? And I don't mean to be rude to anybody in the audience. I actually think that's the wrong question. I think the question is, how do you capture the narrative that is changing as we speak at the ground level, at the community-based level, and take full advantage of that? You can aggregate it up, you can cluster it, you can do all sorts of things to it. But the power of the narrative that is coming out of every major city or minor city in America is extraordinary. And I think it has to do with arts and culture really getting into the mix, getting inside the fence line of what makes communities tick. I think arts and culture has done that for a very, very long time. But I see, particularly with Jamie's work at Art Place, a level of intentionality and a level of sort of intensity that makes it clear that arts and community workers really want to be about the future of their communities. And I think the minute they get into that mix with the kind of the creative problem solving they do and their ability to sort of link between the past and the future, and I think elevate the sense of aspiration of community members, I think it takes, and I think it becomes in many ways self-sustaining. Do you need funding? To be sure, and I think you've got places like Kresge and McKnight and Mellon and others who are willing to do that. But I think over time, it is the strength of the work at the community level that's going to sustain this work. And I'm proud to be a part of that.
So one last question. So Janet was really eager that we get to this because we're in a room full of program officers and program directors who are in a position to attempt to be persuasive, often to presidents and to boards. What advice would you give them?
Good luck with that one. It's got to be one of my staff over in the corner. I would call Jamie and I would put him on the road. I would get some of these board members and some of the presidents of these organizations into the community where they can actually see and touch and feel and kick these projects. They are transformative. I mean, I just think you can't, and you all know this better than I, you can't see these projects, you can't experience these projects, you can't talk with the creators of these projects and not be awed. And I think at the end of the day, I don't think a foundation president needs an elaborate theory of change. Arts matter. They actually move the needle on the things we care about. You can see it every day in every community in America. Go take a look. I think that's the advice I would give you all.
Great. Thank you so much. We're out of time.